Today, Magnus Carlsen won a brilliancy, already deemed one of his best chess games and a positional chess masterpiece. As often happens after a setback like his loss to Duda yesterday, Magnus came out in force, reminding all of his would-be critics why he's been number one for over a decade. Fedoseev opens the game here with pawn d4, Magnus responds with knight f6, and we get c4 and g6. Now already I think that this is indicating that there's going to be some interesting and uncompromising play from both players. They came to play, they're not looking for a short draw, as for example happened in the other game, Karyakin versus Duda. Now that sentiment that the players are playing in an uncompromising fashion is only increased by the next move, pawn to h4 from Fedoseev. Now, this might look like an amateurish move. I'm certainly very used to club players liking to advance their h and a pawns as soon as someone fianchettos a bishop, but this is actually high theory, and one can point to the games of AlphaZero and Leela Chess Zero where these neural network engines have shown the strength of advancing the h and a pawns in many different positions. Unfortunately for Fedoseev, by the end of this game, it is going to be Magnus that is playing very much in an AlphaZero-esque style. Now, after pawn to h4, we get bishop g7, knight c3, d6, e4, knight c6, and a very committal decision, pawn to d5, advancing and gaining space, but giving up the dark squares. Now, of course, Fedoseev is a great player, and he knows exactly what he's doing with a move like pawn to d5, and one should by no means consider this move a mistake, but one should still appreciate, I think, the ramifications of a very committal decision early on like this. And one should pay attention to how Magnus tries to use the weaknesses that are offered up to him, the imbalances that favor him to his advantage. And here, the control of the dark squares is going to be a big part of his game from here on out. We get knight e5 now, bishop e2, looking to play pawn to h5, and pawn to h5. Of course, Magnus shuts that down. That's very much in Magnus's style, and he's going to be doing a lot throughout this game to shut down Fedoseev's play. Bishop f4, castles. It might be tempting here to consider the capture here on e5 because, well, you do double black's pawns, and you also kind of make this bishop bad, but you're giving up the bishop pair, and after, for example, knight f3, which seems very natural, pawn to e6 will fix the pawns. White is actually not in a position to capture here because of discoveries from moving this knight, so this is actually a better position for black. After castles, Fedoseev actually plays knight f3, and now Magnus plays knight takes f3. At this point, we again, very early in the game, get an extremely committal decision from Fedoseev. Pawn takes f3. Now, the computer considers this move, at least my computer considers this move equivalent to bishop takes f3. And it considers both moves to be pretty balanced. It gives a near equal evaluation. While in this case, after bishop takes f3, I think that that equal evaluation indicates a lot of safety for both players, although the game can go in many different directions. That is not what is indicated after pawn takes f3. This is now a very imbalanced position. And I think that most players would much rather have the black side. The compromises here in the pawns are very hard to fix. There's very little flexibility in White's pawn structure from here on out. White is hoping to win based on very active piece play, maybe use of the G file, and that never really comes to fruition. Of course, against someone who wasn't the world chess champion, maybe Fedoseev could have shown the value in a move like pawn takes f3, but in this game, any benefits to this pawn capture never really make themselves felt, and all of the downsides are going to be hampering Fedoseev later in the game. We get pawn c6, queen d2, and there's obviously the idea of bishop h6 here, which you'd love to play. After pawn takes d5 and pawn takes d5, Magnus shuts that down with the very thematic king to h7, controlling the h6 square. Pawn to a4, an interesting idea that's expanding on the queen side and also looking at some rook lifts, which could introduce a lot of dynamicism into the white position. knight d7, and a5, f5. The f file is already making itself felt, and the pressure on the f3 pawn here is significant. Rook to a3, that rook lift that we talked about, knight e5, again, taking aim at the doubled pawns. Bishop e3, and in this position, what Fedoseev really wants to do on the next turn is play pawn to f4, attacking the knight on e5, evicting it, and justifying all of his creative play. If white can play pawn to f4, then white has a really good chance to be better. This is exactly what I was talking about when I said that maybe against a player who didn't play quite as well as Magnus, Fedoseev could have justified all of his creative and committal play. But he is playing against Magnus, and Magnus is sort of one step ahead. And once again, Magnus stops this idea in its tracks. Pawn to f4, a beautiful pawn sacrifice from Magnus, very thematic. It keeps the f file open, it stops pawn to f4 from white, and it introduces some very concrete tactical ideas, including an exchange sacrifice. After f4, we get bishop takes f4. And here you could already think about the sacrifice of the exchange here. Commentators were already saying, what about rook takes f4? But Magnus plays bishop d7 first. And after looking at it a little bit, this just seems super instructive to me. And I really enjoy this move because black's position is improved enormously with bishop d7. Obviously, the bishop is developed. It's now influencing both sides of the board. There are some new ideas like maybe pawn to b5 in some cases. The rooks and the queen are now communicating. There's access to the c file, etc. Bishop d7 just does a lot with a simple move. It's clearly improving black's position. And a big question for white is, do you have a move that is of equal value that also improves your position as much as bishop d7 just improved mine? And it seems like the answer is no, which is just a great indication of why it was better to keep the tension and not sacrifice the exchange yet. Because Fedoseev now plays the move knight to d1, and it's hard to suggest anything better. This move now defends the f3 pawn with the rook. Of course, the knight was blocking the rook a moment ago, and now there's the idea of moving this bishop out of the way, and then you could push the f pawn and things are totally different. White's position is getting a lot of freedom. But now Magnus plays his prepared exchange sacrifice, which of course Fedoseev also saw coming. Rook takes f4. Beautiful move. You know, I could see some saying that 2 exclamation marks is too much for this move. This kind of exchange sacrifice is a very established idea, and both Magnus and Fedoseev and all the Grandmaster commentators were like, hey, this idea is there. But this is a brilliant game. The execution on the idea of this exchange sacrifice and the domination of the dark squares and so many other squares all stem from this move. So if not here, where are you going to recognize the brilliance of this game? I think this just is, recognition of the whole concept of the game. Rook takes f4, queen takes f4, bishop h6, and the queen has to fall back on this diagonal, which is one of the big problems in the position. The queen just doesn't have anywhere good to go and is getting kind of buried on the king side. After queen g3, we see queen to f8, firming up that control of f4 and getting ready to bring the bishop into f4. Knight e3, bishop f4, and queen g2. Now, at this point, I should mention that, there were commentaries at this point, looking at the computer evaluation, which is still saying like 0.0, which is really good. Whenever you see someone sacrifice like an exchange and a pawn or a lot of material, and the computer says, hey, you still have full compensation, you should feel very optimistic about your chances. But there's discussion about, is this exchange sacrifice justified? And I saw Anish Giri comment on Twitter, anticipating later commentary from Magnus and say basically that this is just strategically won. That's probably too much, and one never knows with Anish Giri how serious he is when he's tweeting. And here he's not even tweeting in his own voice. But the way the game goes, it almost feels like it's strategically won from here. I also saw Jan Nepomniachtchi comment that, it's a lot harder to play on a 4x4 board instead of an 8x8 board. And the course of the game really bears that out. This is the only piece in this position that's not playing in this square for white, whereas black just is controlling the whole board, and that problem is only accentuated as we go forth from here. So in this position, we get rook over to c8, controlling the c file, and rook c3. Now, one comment, I'm not quite sure. I think it was Anand in commentary, but one comment was, when you see an exchange sacrifice like this, one of the big questions is, can the rooks get active? If they can get active, then the exchange sacrifice might not work. And a famous example of that is Anand versus Carlsen in the World Championship. And Anand sacrificed an exchange that looked really tempting, but Carlsen activated his rooks and it just didn't work. In this game, though, the rooks never really get active. It makes so much sense to exchange off the rook because it's very active here. You don't want to allow the rook to remain on the c file, but this really does lock white into a position in which there aren't really any active pieces, and the rook on h1 never really gets into the game. Rook takes c3, pawn takes c3, and the queen runs over to c8. A beautiful square. Fedoseev plays pawn to c4. It seems like everything is defended, but on the other hand, everything is also restricted. Everything is blocked in here. Another nice point about queen c8 is that your queen and bishop now make a battery, and if white castles, you can play bishop h3, and you can pick up an exchange. Now, we get b5. We get the en passant capture here. Actually, I should make another point here. After b5, and a takes b6, a takes b6. Yeah, right here. This maybe was one of Fedoseev's best outs. Here, what if you do give the exchange back? Now, later on, there was a lot of discussion about when was the right time to sacrifice the exchange. And maybe earlier is better. Here you do allow bishop to h3, and Magnus needs to go for it. He's not in a position, once the rook starts thinking about getting active, to continue to play down the exchange. So bishop h3, queen h1, and bishop takes f1, king takes f1. Here, Magnus definitely still has full compensation for the exchange, but one of the biggest problems in white's position, that rook on h1, a problem that doesn't really get resolved, is gone. So that was definitely worthy of consideration. It's tough to give back material, but when you do need to, sometimes earlier is better than later. So after the trade on b6, though, Fedoseev plays queen g1. Now, there was a beautiful line pointed out here by Danya Naroditsky in the commentary. Here, he mentioned the possibility of b5. Now, the engine here is saying knight g2, and it's still very unclear, but if white captures on b5, the line that Danya pointed out is queen c1 check, knight back to d1, and here, queen d2 check, king f1, queen takes e2 check. Beautiful. A queen sacrifice leading to a spectacular minor piece mate. King takes e2, bishop takes b5, forces the king back to e1, and knight takes f3, checkmate. That would have been a stunning finish. The way the game progressed is beautiful too, but that would have been immortal game territory. Like, I think everyone would have been like, this is Magnus's best game of all time. No question, no argument. We all just agree now. In any case, after queen g1, we actually see queen to a8, which is a better move than b5, unfortunately. Also, queen a6 was good, but we had to show that, really beautiful, beautiful checkmate with the queen sacrifice. King f1, the queen infiltrates queen a2, and here we get knight g2. At this point, there was some criticism from some who said, hey, queen b1 check is stronger than queen a1 check that was played in the game. And the reason is that the queen here on b1 is supporting some lines where the c pawn is breaking and then advancing, whereas on a1, it's not controlling, for example, the c2 square, and that's, maybe a little weaker than what was played in the game after knight g2, queen a1 check. But the difference is not very large. Magnus still has a huge advantage, and the main idea is just that he controls everything. We're approaching Zugzwang in this position. Knight e1, queen b2, knight g2. The knight is trying to shuffle. Queen c1, check. The knight goes back to e1, and queen to d2. At this point, the knight can no longer continue shuffling. Really, white is almost out of moves at this point. It's a huge problem. The bishop can't move. The rook can't move unless you're ready to give back the exchange. And then Magnus probably isn't even going to take it. And the queen has no scope. It's dire for white in this position. If knight g2, you try to continue, hey, I'm just going to shuffle the knight back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Then knight d3 is a beautiful finish. Bishop takes, queen takes here. King over to e1, you have bishop d2, king d1, and the final bishop introduces itself with bishop a4. This bishop is a beautiful spectator, but it's been a bit of a spectator, but here it gets into the game. Anyway, after queen d2, we see queen g2, king g7. This is just like announcing Zugzwang here. I'm just going to start maneuvering with my king, and you can't move anything, and it's true. Magnus's control here is just an incredible thing, a thing of beauty. Rook g1, king over to f8, queen h1, and pawn to e6. This is going to just crack the white position open because after the exchange here, and if you take on e6, then the bishop is getting involved in an attack on c4 here. If you take on e6, after the capture on d5, I mean, you're either getting a situation where there's now all of a sudden a passed b pawn, or you're giving a situation where the bishop can get into the game. So e6 is the break that really brings home, I'm not just sitting here, I'm actually making progress and you can't hold. Rook g3, please take my exchange. No, I don't want your exchange. Pawn takes d5, bishop f5. As said, the bishop is getting introduced here. Rook g1, king f7, rook g3, and knight d7. A very nice move. The knight has, among many other ideas, the idea of coming around here to b3 and then over to c1, and the bishop is trapped. After knight d7, Fedoseev plays rook g5, just insisting on the capture of the rook. And Magnus finally obliges, but after bishop takes, pawn takes, knight e5, Fedoseev resigns in this position. He can't move anything. Magnus can pick off pawns at will. He now has a passed h pawn as well. It's just completely over. And wow, just what an achievement by Magnus. Beautiful game, incredible exchange sacrifice. So many fine points throughout the game. Unquestionably a positional masterpiece. Some have called it Magnus's immortal Zugzwang game, and that seems entirely fair. Beautiful game from Magnus Carlsen. For more videos from Chess.com and to be alerted of our live coverage of the FIDE World Cup and the FIDE World Championship and so many more events, be sure to hit that subscribe button.